Now here's a build you can hear coming from a mile away. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/32nd scale early production M4A1 Sherman tank with the T34 Calliope, or in this case, the Screamin Mimi system. The model in this video is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and/or purchase. However, like I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. This model received quite a few detail aftermarket add-ons as well as several other scratch build components in order to bring it up to the condition that we have here. In this video, we're going to be giving this model a thorough in-box review as well as also discussing all of the additions and modifications that were made to the model, bringing it up to the way you see it here. So stay tuned because there's going to be a ton of info coming right at you. To kick this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is the early production M4A1 Sherman tank, but this one's a bit unique because it also features the T34 Calliope multi-launch rocket system. When the M4 Sherman was originally designed, this was actually the configuration that the designers had in mind, being a vehicle that has an all-cast upper hull along with a single-piece cast turret. Although this was the original concept for the Sherman, when it actually came down to produce the things, it took a little bit extra time longer to produce the casting machinery as well as the dies and tooling required to get these vehicles into production. So as a stopgap measure, the engineers decided to switch materials from using an all-cast type system for the components to utilizing a mosaic of parts comprising of smaller cast pieces as well as rolled steel plate. These pieces would all be welded together and this vehicle would become the M4 Sherman. However, after the tooling was figured out and they were able to produce the vehicles with the all-cast setup, this vehicle entered production and it received the designation of M4A1. Both the M4 and the M4A1 utilize many similar features. For instance, both utilize the Continental radial gasoline engine, which of course was a carryover from the M3 In fact, the entire lower hull pretty much was carried over from the M3 with a few moderate changes made here or there. Both vehicles, of course, would feature a single 75mm main gun found in a fully revolving turret and two M1919A4 machine guns, the first located in the hull and the second was located in the turret for the coax. A single M250 caliber machine gun was to be mounted in the cupola for anti-aircraft use. Some really early renditions of both vehicles featured two bow M1919 machine guns which were fixed in place in the bow, very similar to what was also seen on several examples of the M3 Both of these vehicles utilized a system called direct vision, where this was a feature where on the upper hull you had these two integrally mounted periscopes built into the hull with these armored covers that would be hinged over them. Basically, these gave the ability for the two front crew members to see out of the vehicle when the vehicle's all buttoned up. The system was good in theory and actually had some pretty good visibility for the driver. Unfortunately, this feature was a bit of a detriment because once the vehicle started to see combat, it was deemed that these two locations here were shot traps and were actually a weakness in the armor. Because of this, the DV system was quickly eliminated where the visors were permanently welded shut and in some cases extra steel was added in place in order to reinforce these locations, bringing the armor protection up to where it would have had it like several of the other vehicles that came afterwards. As I stated before, and as most people know, the M4 Sherman family is heavily influenced from design lessons learned from the M3 And with this pattern of Sherman here, it has more of a lineage and connection to the M3 as opposed to the later versions of the Sherman family that came afterwards. Specifically with the composition of the lower hull, you'll see that this particular example still features a fully riveted lower hull. This would change as production would ramp up to the use of welding. And the other feature that's very interesting found on this particular example is with the suspension system. This one utilizes the M3 Lee platform of VVSS in comparison to the later redesign units for the M4, where the M3 has the return roller mounted directly above the bogie housing, and the bogie housings themselves were a little bit lighter in weight compared to the redesign units found on the Sherman, which were much more durable in comparison. Another quirk found on several early renditions of the M4A1 involves the exhaust manifold system. This particular example here utilizes the same pepper pot exhausts that are found on the M3 Lee platform. However, by the time these vehicles started to roll off the assembly line, the design for the exhaust system was changed, where the exhaust manifolds were completely redesigned, and where the current exhausts are, new air filtration boxes were going to be fitted in place. A few versions of vehicles with the pepper pot style did complete assembly and were actually fielded. However, after those handful left the factory doors, the remainder were retrofitted to have the upgraded exhaust system. These vehicles that were retrofitted are identifiable because they have this distinctive round patch welded in the location where the pepper pot system once stood. Although I could go further into detail about the Sherman, let's go ahead and jump to the T34 Calliope system. The T34 was a system designed by the U.S. military in 1943 and was adopted shortly after. This system was intended to be a conversion kit where you can take any Sherman tank, regardless of type, from the motor pool and mount this arrangement to it, which would now have the Sherman fire 60 4.5-inch fin stabilized unguided rockets. Each of these rockets were high explosive and contained the exact same explosive power as a 105mm howitzer. The advantage about this system is that this vehicle can keep up with the other tanks in the platoon, but also offer now some excellent close quarter support. There were a few variants of the T34 that were designed, and these units did enter into production. Several were fitted to vehicles during the closing months of World War II, and these vehicles did see action during this time frame. However, after the war, these units were all removed, and no examples of a T34 equipped Sherman are left in existence today. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when this model was first started to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this 1/32 scale Monogram re-release of their vintage Sherman M4A1 Screamin Mimi kit. This was one kit that I was actually really happy that they went ahead and reintroduced, because it's actually one of my favorite old tank kits from this era. This particular kit here is a very recent addition to the stash. In fact, I picked this one up from Amazon.com a couple months ago. In fact, I got this model at the exact same time I ordered the 1/72 scale skipjack kit, which of course I've done a video on and can be found on the channel. Just like with the skipjack, I got this kit for free because of some saved up credit card points. But normally these models are fairly affordable and can be had anywhere between the $14 to about the $30 price range. Back to the kit itself, this kit here was designed by Monogram in the mid-1970s time frame. So we're looking at about 1974 to 1975. Of course, this is far from Monogram's first 1/32 scale plastic tank kit that they would release. This honor would be going back to the late 1950s with their 1/32 scale M4A1 patent kit, which, by the way, yes, it is 1/32 scale. Don't believe me? Watch the video where I compare it to a 1/35 scale patent. Anyway, in that video, I go into more depth on what the market was like in terms of plastic tank model kits of the era, and how the Monogram M4A1 was really something that was very unique and was something that was going to set the path forward for Monogram in the following years. Well, upon the success of that kit, Monogram went ahead and designed several other kits in the 1/32 scale range. And this would include several German pattern vehicles based on the Panzer IV chassis, as well as several other vehicles based on the Sherman platform of chassis. Specifically with the Sherman pattern of vehicles, we have a few that come to mind. We have this particular kit. There was an M3 Lee If I'm not mistaken, I believe there was also an M3 Grant, and there was a standard welded hull version of the M4 Sherman. What's unique about these generation of kits is that these kits all utilize the exact same lower hull components, which give you the same hull, track, running gear, and some of the other below the belt fittings. With this in mind, this is how Monogram was able to tool up a good little range of kits, all recycling really some of the same tooling. All of the kits that I just mentioned are very interesting in their own right, but I'll go over in more depth on those models if/when I ever get a chance to do a model showcase video on them. Back to the kit that we have here though. This kit here was very interesting in my opinion because of two factors. First is the subject matter, namely the Screamin Mimi Calliope system. This was the first plastic tank kit rendering this setup. It's a bit of a niche item, so it's again one of those vehicle choices that was very interesting and a little bit out of the box compared to some of the other options that are out there. It's also important to mention that this was the first rendition of the Calliope system on a Sherman in a plastic kit form. You wouldn't see something like this until several decades later in the mid-1990s when Italy would tool up their own version of one of these type of vehicles. Outside of the already cool Screamin Mimi setup, something else that Monogram went ahead and did was with the choice of Sherman itself. You see, Monogram accidentally produced a very unique and very interesting version of the Sherman. To the casual observer, they'll just say, well, it's just a Sherman or it's an M4A1 if they know a thing or two. But what's really cool is that this is actually a very early rendition of the M4A1 Sherman. In fact, this particular kit here is probably rarer than most of the other options of Shermans that have been produced over the years, even up until today. And even more interesting, for the longest period of time, the Monogram here was the only option available if you were looking for this pattern of Sherman. It wouldn't be until recent years where you would have companies like Dragon come out with their DV M4A1, or I believe Tasca, if I'm not mistaken, rendered this kit as well. But prior to the release of those two kits, this one here was the only one in town, and in some cases, or I should say with some aspects of the detailing that I'll touch upon later, it's still the only one to have these features present. So in many ways, this kit here is still relevant today as it was all those years ago. Back to the kit itself. Like I stated before, this kit was released by Monogram in the mid-1970s timeframe, and a good number of these kits were produced, and they did sell pretty well because they were fairly popular. Just like with the M4A1 however, this kit would go in and out of production as time goes on. At one point, they were out of production for a good number of years, about a decade or so, and the existing kits on the market were drying up, and at one point were actually considered to be collector's items. This went on for a number of years until the late 1990s when Monogram re-released this kit in basically the original format as it was in the 1970s timeframe. After that production batch ceased, this kit again was shelved for about a decade or so until in the recent history of the mid-2010s or so, this kit entered back into production, and at the moment of filming this, these kits are still readily available. However, in comparison to the M4A1, that kit is far more easily accessible compared to these ones here, where those ones are found in stores such as Hobby Lobby or any type of craft store that stocks Revell or Monogram kits, while this model over here is more common and prolific via online vendors. Something else I want to touch upon is that just like with the M4A1, this kit here is all comprised of injection molded plastic parts, with the exception of the tracks, which are single piece vinyl. Also, just like with the M4A1, Monogram went ahead and engineered a lot of functional capabilities in this kit, which I'll be touching upon as the video goes on. Starting with the model's box art and graphic design, this here is the configuration that you will find in the kits that were re-released in the 2015 era timeframe. Just like with the other Monogram kits that have been previously mentioned in this video, over the years, when Monogram would re-release this kit, the configuration and graphic design of the box arts would sometimes change. For this generation re-release, Monogram went with a configuration which was very similar to the ones found on the other kits that were released around the same time frame. This would include the M3 Lee, their M4A1, and also the welded hull version of the M4 Sherman. For the box art itself, it's pretty much what you see is what you get. We have here a photograph of the built model in question. I believe this is the exact same built model that have been showcased on the other box arts that I just mentioned. Here we can see the Calliope system firing. Obviously this is all done in post. In fact, the entire image is cobbled together in Photoshop. In the background we have this foggy type scene, and we have two M4A1s in the background, which are actually the same kit, just sans the Screamin Mimi setup. For the title and typography, Monogram went with the Band of Brothers style typeface, where, you know, it's all caps with the scratched up appearance that you see here. And the remainder of the information is pretty much what you would expect on one of these type of kits. Of course, this one has the Monogram logo with the big M. This is something that was seen on Monogram kits from the 1970s time frame. Obviously, it's a plastic model kit, skill level 3. Ooh, you know, they're not screwing around with this one. And here you can see that the label is clearly labeled on this kit as being 1/32 scale. The remaining graphic design is quite typical. Here we have just, you know, another thumbnail of the image that I just mentioned before, as well as with the same information with that Band of Brothers typeface. On this panel here, we have some photographs of the built model. Note, we have two options of which you can render this kit. One of them is with the Screamin Mimi, and the other version is just sans Screamin Mimi, and it's your typical early production DV M4A1 Sherman tank. The kit does come with a few figures, a driver and two other crewmen, which you will be able to see once I crack the box open further. The other side, same type of information, and on this panel here we have some other information, namely corporate info as well as some stats on size and scale and all that other good stuff. Pretty customary, which you tend to see on Monogram type kits. On the back panel, nothing much to talk about there. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and crack the cellophane open so I could actually get inside the kit contents. I'm gonna go ahead and crack open the box, and you can see, just like with the M48A2 kit, everything is sealed in their plastic bags. And just like I mentioned before, this is an entirely injection molded based plastic model kit. There's gonna be no photo etch or any other type of that fancy schmancy modern stuff that is going to be contained in this kit here. So let's go ahead and open up the first bag, which looks to contain the suspension, as well as the lower hull. The entire kit is molded in this dark olive drab colored plastic, and this is something that I've seen consistently done on the other Monogram Sherman based kits that I have in my collection. This would include both another M4A1 Screamin Mimi and also an M3 Lee. Unlike those kits, however, this one has something new where we have the sticker on the inside with some more company information. But also you can see that the mold itself was not touched, as it still has the original copyright information for when these kits were first developed in the mid-1970s time frame. Also at this point here, you can see, like what I was referencing before, that this hull is actually for an M3 Lee. Obviously it's all riveted, but this is definitely an M3 Lee just from the rear plate here, as the Sherman back section is slightly different. But again, I'll go over more about that as the video goes on. Just one more little addition on that point. Here you can see the provision for mounting the sponson mounted 75mm gun, along with the M3 Lee pattern of bow front fenders. But again, more information on that is to follow. The next runner takes us to the suspension parts, and like I stated with the other part, this runner here is supplied with the hull and would be used on the other M4 and M3 Lee based kits that Monogram would ever produce. Here you can see the M3 Lee pattern of VVSS suspension. Note they are decently rendered, however, in current kit parlance, these pieces here would probably be a bit overly simplistic, but again, for the era that this kit was made in, they were pretty good, and in my opinion, still held up pretty good with age. Here you can see the open spoke pattern of row wheels, as well as the early pattern of VVSS sprockets. Here you can also see the flange systems for the 3-piece transmission cover, along with the return rollers and even the volute springs themselves. On this little section of runner that popped off of the other sprue, you can see some of the details for the exhaust manifold. Because this is a really early version of the Sherman, it actually utilizes the M3 Lee pepper box pattern of exhaust. It's comprising of two pieces. We have here the exhaust stack itself, and then what would be the pepper box on the real vehicle. But I actually have something up my sleeve that I'm going to be mentioning as the video goes on. The next bag here consists of the components that's separated from the other versions of the M3 Lee and Sherman kit, which of course would consist of the upper hull, the turret, and the Screamin Mimi system. So let's dump these parts out of the bag. Starting with this runner here, this is quite obviously the upper hull, and in my opinion, the casting and the moldings are really, really nicely done. They have some really good geometry to them, and the detailing on them, or I should say the detailing that is present on them, is decently rendered. Note the direct vision ports that we have right here on the front. Also, you can see the front bow bolt strip, and the fasteners are integrally molded in. We have the hinge detailing found on the bow hatches, fuel filler caps, the Grouser air intake section, as well as the rear engine deck. Basically, what you see is exactly what you get. Obviously, the texturing that is typically found on more modern kits is not going to be present on this one, but having said that, there is some texturing found on the moldings themselves. Not sure if this was to replicate the actual casting found on the real vehicle, or if it's just any artifacts left over from the molding process. Regardless, it's not a completely smooth mirror image type surface, and you do have some texturing there. I will say that the geometry on this piece is nicely rendered. You can see it does have the appropriate taper found on the sides. And again, just, Monogram did a very good job with the design of this piece. On the same runner, we have some other components like a 75mm travel lock, rear taillights. These are a bit dated, you could say, because the taillight lens is integrally molded to the brush guard. That's generally not something that's seen these days. We have here those two little dimpy mud flaps that are found on the back. If anyone watched my 1/6 scale M4A4 videos, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And here you can see the crew figures that I was touching upon before. I always did like this guy. He just totally relaxed with his M1 carbine in hand. Next runner takes us to the turret. With this being an early production Sherman, we have here the appropriate low bustle single hatch pattern of 75mm turret. Just like with the hull, there's really no cast texturing found on the piece, but there is some texturing there left over from the mold making procedure. You can see the integrally molded in details, namely the turret blower, the well for the antenna base, and we can also see that they integrally molded on the gunner's optic. The split ring cupola is integrally molded in, but overall the piece is decently rendered. Here we have the lower pan, nothing much really to talk about there. And here we have the mantlet. Obviously there's a bit of flash on this component over here, but it's not something that should be hard to clean up a few seconds with some sandpaper, or possibly even an X-Acto. On the rotor drum itself, you can see the fasteners that are molded on. Fairly basic, but again, for 1974, this is actually some pretty good tooling. While on that note, you can see the periscope detailing right here, but this is not going to be kept on this model, and if anyone has watched the other Screamin Mimi video, you'll probably know why. The next piece takes us to the 75mm gun. Note that it is a 2-half assembly, which is quite typical on these armor modeling kits. Only on this one here, it's not just the barrel detailing, but they also have a little bit of the internal breech detailing as well. It has the recuperators as well as some of the other equipment. It is basic in its overall shape and detailing, but again, it's something that is typically not rendered on most other kits. Here you can see the remainder of the parts, namely the bow hatches, the cupola hatch. There is a sinkhole found on that periscope there. Not sure if that's a common thing or if it's just something that's found on this particular example, but it's something to point out. And we do have separately molded headlights and headlight brush guards, which is interesting because the taillight brush guards and lenses were integrally molded as one piece. Here we have the bow M1919. Note the little ventilation holes are integrally molded in. They're a bit on the shallow end, but they are still there. Over here we see some of the Screamin Mimi system. These two sections here are the supports that hold up the Screamin Mimi rocket bed. And note the detailing that are found on the pieces. We have the springs as well as the other clevis and linkage system, which are present on the real unit. This here is the elevation yoke and the yoke mount, which I'll be touching upon as the video goes on. The last plastic parts in the box consist of the Screamin Mimi rocket setup. All of the pods consist of a two-part assembly, and this is true for the other plastic renditions of the Screamin Mimi that I've seen in 1/35 scale on the market. Because of this assembly, you will have some seams to contend with, and this is something that I touched upon in the other Monogram Sherman rebuild video that I recently posted, but here you can see what they look like up close in the raw plastic form. Note that the rocket pods do have their support straps that are integrally molded in, as well as the underframe detailing as well. On the thinner pods, you can see exactly what they look like. And again, the same type of details are trickled on these units as well. At the very bottom of the box, we have here our vinyl tracks. They are very flexible and are the chevronless pattern of the Sherman track. One error that the tracks do have that I will point out right now is that Monogram went ahead and molded the end connector teeth on the pads themselves as opposed on the hinge area in between the two links. Why this was done, your guess is really as good as mine. But what's funny to point out that Tamiya did the exact same error on their 1/35 scale M3 Lee and M3 Grant kits that have been on the market for many, many years. I believe this was done because it gives the track better articulation, but again, this is really just speculative. As for the quality of the tracks themselves, they are really good for the medium. And even though they are as old as they do have some decent details that are rendered into them. Note, this is true for both the interior as well as the exterior portion of the track. On the very bottom of the box takes to the instruction manual, and it's actually thicker than I would have anticipated for a kit like this, but it's standard Monogram quality. As for the illustrations, I believe these might be remade from the original drawings, but it's hard to say offhand. But as you can see, what you see is basically what you get. The instructions themselves, they look like they should do the job pretty well, but again, we'll see as the build goes on. And the last thing to mention are the decals themselves. The kit comes with a set of water slide decals. They're on this blue paper that we have here. And of course you have quite a few options to mark this vehicle because again, you can build this vehicle in one of two configurations. From what I've seen in the past, as well as from what I'm seeing right now, the decals appear to be really good quality, and I'm not anticipating there being any issues with the decals when they get applied, as well as also once the model gets sealed up with its varnish. But again, we'll see as the video goes on. And here's the model going through its construction phase. At this point, you can see that the front transmission cover has some cast texturing added to it. This is done for two reasons. First, it gives the appropriate cast texturing, which would be present on this component, but also what it does is that this eliminates that seam which runs across this portion here of the lower hull. As we can recall, the upper and lower hulls have the transmission cover molded in, so when you glue it together, you are going to have this unsightly seam running across this portion here. Fortunately on the Sherman, since these pieces are casted on the real unit, blending in the seam and covering it up with the texturing is one that's easily done. But that's not really the important aspect of the build at this point. What doesn't involve the front, it actually involves the back, specifically the underneath. Here you can see some of the mods that were made to the under portion just before it progresses past this point. As we saw earlier, the lower hull is from the M3 Lee, and although the lower hull, or I should say the rear portion of the M3 Lee and the early pattern Shermans were very, very similar to each other, there were some key differences between the two. First change that I did was actually adding the walls that we have here on the sides. With the way the kit is, this entire area here is completely open, and this is something that would not be present on the Sherman. This was built up with sections of sheet styrene, And then this closes off these two areas over here, giving it for a more authentic look. The next addition I made is this grill work that we have right here. On the Sherman, with the way the hull is, it's actually open on the top portion, and this is so the cool air that gets blown out by the radiator fans has a place to exit. This little detailing is absent on the Monogram kit, but to add it, I just went ahead and took a piece of photo etch mesh, I cut it to the appropriate shape, and simply mounted it in this location. From the grill takes to the rear engine hatch, and I went ahead and fabricated the little grab handle that we have here. Oddly enough, the little handle locations are present on the plastic molding, but no other detailing is present. In order to add this detailing with a pin vise, I went ahead and just drilled out these two little locations, bent a small little wire handle out of some floor wire, and then fastened it in place. But this now leads us to the big addition that needs to be done, and that is to the exhaust manifolds themselves. Like I said before, the Monogram M4A1 is very interesting because they went with such an early pattern vehicle, and it's actually, again, one of the rarities on the market. With the way the exhausts are, this one lifts the pepper pot style exhaust from the M3 Lee. The kit does supply you with this detailing, but it is woefully simplistic compared to the type of detailing that would be found on the real exhausts. In order to add this detailing, I went ahead and omitted the kit components altogether. I also went ahead and deleted the provisions that were found on the rear plate here that gave you the base detailing with all the fasteners where the exhaust would elbow out of. In their place, I went ahead and tooled up these components that we have right here. These details are made from HD 3D print and supply you with all of the details needed to have the pepper pot style exhaust found on your early pattern of M4A1 or M4 Sherman. These pieces here are listed on the East Coast Armory Shapeways store, along with the other smaller scale detail components that I've cobbled together and tooled up over the years. The set here, you'll notice, contains 4 pieces. 2 of them are the pepper pot exhaust, while the other 2 are missing from the sprue at this time. The reason why they are missing is because these 2 components were used on another Monogram 1/32 scale Screamin Mimi build that I posted on the channel. Hopefully by the time this video drops, that video should either already be posted or it's probably going to be the next video that follows this one. What the set has is that it gives you the option to model the Sherman in 2 different configurations. You can either have it with the early pattern of pepper pot exhaust, or you can render it as one of the upgraded Shermans, where they went ahead and deleted the pepper pots and went with the standard Sherman type exhaust manifold. Because they added the air filtration boxes and the overhead exhaust manifold outtakes, the locations for the pepper pots were plated over with a welded steel plate. On the sprue over here would have been the steel plates with their weld beads already integrally printed on. Again, more information about this is discussed on the other video, which I should have the link for listed below in the video description. There, I recommend checking it out in case you want to model the vehicle in that configuration. It does require slightly different rear section detailing like that I've done over here, but again, more information on that is discussed in that video. For this one, I'm going to make it with the original pattern of pepper pots, and if you could see with the camera brought in closer, it has all of the appropriate detailing present on the component. We have the mounting plate complete with its fasteners. There's a small little step down section found on the elbow where it goes in the straightaway. We have the top flange mounting plate with its fasteners, as well as the pepper pot detailing itself. Note all of the little perforations are present, and they are with the appropriate numbers that would be found on the real unit. And yes, I actually did count them out, and yes, it was a bit of a pain. But all of that frustration, all that work paid off with these components here, which look absolutely exquisite and should look good as soon as they are painted and fitted to the vehicle. Before I can go ahead and fit them on, I'm going to snip them off of the sprue, spray paint them with some flat black so that they have a thorough coat of primer around them, and then I could secure them in place. With any luck, this comes out on camera, but here you can see the exhaust system now that it's primed in flat black paint. All little perforations are present, like I stated before. Also, one thing I did was I added the crimp line for the rear spine of the can that would be pressed on the rear portion of the exhaust manifold itself. If we compare the new ECA one with the old original Monogram one, well, the difference should be clear as day. Starting with the model suspension, all of the components that you see here are the stock kit originals and were utilized stock out of the box. There aren't any single changes made to this model at this portion in any way, shape, or form. The suspension goes together very well, and the pieces have some functionality to them. Just like with many of the other kits from this era, this model does have some playability in that the tracks are free to rotate, and all of the row wheels, including the top return rollers, are able to spin with the tracks. The one modification, however, that I just remembered that I did involves the sprocket. If you notice on the center portion of the sprocket, there's a small little hole found right there, dead center. This little divot is found on all of these Sherman sprockets, but on this kit here, it was missing. The only thing that was done in order to add this was I took my micro dremel bit, put it on my pin vise, and added to the appropriate location. The same was also done to the opposite side. Of course, this being an ECA Sherman video, I have to do the court-ordered segment where I go over the composition of both the rear idler as well as the top return rollers. There's a lot of misunderstanding out there, even at this day and age, where people don't understand what materials that these components are made of. And when they paint them improperly, and it's actually a mistake on their build. And this is true for not just several pictures I've seen out there, but also on several of the high-profile modeling YouTube channels. They tend to make this mistake sometimes as well. And that is, they seem to presume that both of these components are rubber rimmed. Again, it's a pretty easy mistake to fall into because all the main row wheels have rubber tires, and on the HVSS Sherman, everything is rubber rimmed. So ergo, they make the assumption that these two are in the same manner, and that is not the case. On the VVSS equipped Shermans, and this also includes the M3 Lee, the M3 Grant, even the M2 medium tank, the idler and the return rollers were exclusively steel. There was no rubber found on them. So when you're painting them, you do not want to go with black paint or any sort of rubber type paint to paint the tire sections of these. Instead, like I always mention in these videos, I use silver paint to paint the face as well as the side portion here, where the idler is always making contact with the teeth of the track in operation. Same is also true for the return rollers found on top. From the material used on the wheels takes us to the tracks. The tracks on the model are the kit original ones, as I touched upon before, and are decently rendered for not just the material, but also for the age of the molds that are found on this model. The tracks represent the early pattern of rubber chevron tracks, which for a Sherman of this pattern is more than appropriate. The tracks go together without any sort of problems, and like I touch upon in all these videos with vehicles with the single piece track, are painted with Tamiya acrylics. The use of spray paints is something that I don't recommend, as you don't know what composition is inside that spray paint, and this may lead to issues when it makes contact with the tracks. Like I touched upon in the other Monogram M4A1 old tank repair video, when I first built that model all those years ago, I just used straight up spray paint to paint the tracks, and it had a negative reaction to the material. Fortunately, I was able to salvage those tracks, and even 20 years later, the tracks held up very well and they didn't decay or fall apart on me. However, I have seen situations where the tracks do crumble and fall apart due to some sort of chemical reaction with the paint. In order to avoid this, it's best to use acrylics when painting your tracks. And for my builds, I like Tamiya acrylics because they seem to work the best. Outside of the color used for the main base coat on the tracks, after the black was added, I went ahead and painted the teeth sections found on either end of the tracks with a different color. This is an easy way to improve the accuracy of your model as well as give it some little extra flavor. On these American tanks, of course, specifically with this pattern of track, the toot sections would be made from steel, while the middle section would have been made from rubber. If you paint them with two different type of colors, you get to distinguish between the two details, which again gives you better accuracy. On this model here, the teeth are painted with olive drab. However, just like with anything Sherman related, you have several options available on how to render these components. Me personally, I like to use olive drab because again, this is just something that works best with my taste. One final thing I want to mention with the tracks is that on this particular example here, the tracks are very, very flexible. And this is a big improvement compared to some of the older Monogram kits that I have seen and even worked on. The older models, like for instance the other one that was in the OTR video, that track, even when new, was very, very stiff. And in comparison, the ones here on the newer release kits are very, very flexible. As you can see, they move very well and very fluidly. This tank does have some really good roll to it. And yes, if you're looking for something out there with a model that has some playability to it, this one here is a perfect choice for you because you can literally just push this thing across a rug and it will roll absolutely perfectly. Although again, if you're going to keep your model as a nice display piece, you want to keep the playing to a minimum because obviously after a while you will wear out the paint found on the tracks as well as even the wheels. I'm pretty sure some people out there are wondering why I even needed to mention that statement, but I do frequently get comments in the various videos I post asking about playability on these models, and if you're looking for playability, this one here might be something to look into. I also seen the same type of setup on many other modern re-release versions of the old school Monogram kits. Another one comes to mind is the 1/32 scale, and yes, the M4A1 from Monogram is 1/32 scale. I could make a whole video arguing that and showing the receipts for that, but anyway, that kit also have tracks made in the same type of rubber material that we have here, and I also seen a similar type of material used on the Atlantis reissues of the 1/48 scale kits from Aurora. Which, by the way, all that is fantastic news because this makes not only the model playable if you want to do that, but if you're just looking for a easy assembly, the flexible tracks is something that goes on easier without causing really too much stress on the axles of both the sprocket and the idler during the installation. If the tracks are stiffer, this may lead to some stress during the installation and potentially you can snap off an axle, which will add to some complications to the build. The tracks being softer, they go on without any problems and it just makes for a better build overall. Moving onward takes to the transmission cover. Like I touched upon before, there was a seam that would have originally been found in this area over here, and that was covered up with these bodywork as well as cast texturing. Now that the model is fully painted and weathered, you really get a good appreciation of the final look of this section with the texturing added. Along with the transmission cover, texturing was also added to the upper hull, as well as also the turret that I'll be touching upon in a moment. If anyone watching this video is interested in knowing the technique and material that I use for my cast texturing on my models, I recommend checking out the other video that I recently published on my channel that focuses on another Monogram M4A1 Sherman. Only that model is an old tank repair, but in that video I do show the technique from start to finish and I go over all of the information on how that technique is executed. The link to that particular video is found in the video description listed below. While on the transmission cover, you get to see some of the other details that I added, namely the front fender supports that we have on either side. These supports are found on all Sherman tanks, but tend to be omitted on the majority of Sherman tank kits on the market in a multitude of different scales. This is specifically true for the older kits that are on the market. With this model here dating back to 1975, it definitely falls in that purview. Fortunately, these bits of detailing here are really easy to fabricate and scratch build, and it's the same technique that I use on all the other builds on this channel, being in 1/6 scale, 1/16, or 1/35. Basically, to fabricate them, you take some thin metal type material, in this case, soda can aluminum, you cut it to the appropriate length and width, and then you also bend it to the appropriate shape with a plier. Once the components are bent and cut to shape, they get fitted, and once mounted in place, they really fill in the front area of the model, giving it much better accuracy compared to just leaving them omitted. From the fender supports takes us to the fenders themselves. One change that I made to this model, even compared to the other one in the OTR lineup, was with the stamped pattern found on the tin work. You see, like I mentioned before, this model here recycles the lower hull from the Monogram M3A1. And although the two vehicles are very similar, if not identical in many respects, one area where the M3A1 did differ from the Sherman was with the embossed pattern found right here on the tin work. If you look at the M3A1, there is some more geometry found on this location on the rear, and they have some more rigidity stamps pressed in. These are not present on the M4 Sherman, however, they are still found on the molded tooling. In order to improve the model, I simply just polish these away with a little bit of bodywork. This would include removing the bulk of the material with a dremel with a high-speed removal bit, and then polishing down any sort of remnants with some fine sandpaper. Once removed, the accuracy of the model also improves immensely. On this piece of tin work over here, as we can recall, there are provisions for securing on a machine gun tripod, I believe either 30 or 4 or 50. Regardless, that bit of detailing wouldn't necessarily be found on this section on the Sherman, so it was promptly filled in and eliminated, giving you the look that you see here. On the opposite tin work, we see the addition of a siren. This siren here is a resin casting that I've touched upon in the OTR video. Basically, it's a casting that I use for all of my 1/35th scale models that don't have the siren, like this old school Monogram kit here, or they were broken off and missing and I'm doing a rebuild on them. Regardless, the siren is a copy of the Tamiya siren, only I went ahead and hollowed out the front portion over here to give it better accuracy. The piece was molded, and then the version you see here is a casting. In addition to the resin casting, you can see I fabricated the power cable, which would emerge from this corner here of the Sherman's hull, specifically the M4A1's hull, and snake around to the back side here of the siren. This is another bit of detailing that I add to all of my Sherman builds, and it's one that also improves the accuracy. Jumping to the rear of the model, here you get to see all the work that I mentioned before, now fully completed, painted, and weathered. Like I stated before, the rear plate here was really the one section of this model that received the most amount of work in order to improve the detailing as well as the accuracy. And once completed, it really does enhance the model immensely. Moving upward takes to the rear tin work, and these sections over here are kit supplied and were utilized out of box. With this vehicle being an early production M4A1, the dimpy little rear mudguards here are more than appropriate for this pattern of Sherman. The two fenders that we have here are purely optional, and if you decide to omit them on your model, you're not harming in any way, shape, or form the model's accuracy. In fact, the other Monogram M4A1 Sherman that I have has these components omitted on them for basically the reason that I just mentioned. One other thing I want to mention is that these rear dimpy fenders were not something that were seen for very long. The fenders were easily damaged in field, and so they were frequently just removed. Also, they were omitted on many later patterns of the Sherman that followed. I could attest to their fragility, as I actually fabricated these out of metal in 1/6 scale and mounted them to my radio-controlled M4A4 Sherman. And one problem that tank does have is that these fenders are easily damaged from just basic wear and tear and operation, be it things getting kicked up by the tracks or even backing the model up. I've repaired them on more than one occasion. However, because this model does have the pepper pot exhaust, I thought it would be really fitting to keep on the dimpy mudguards. Also, because I had the other version of the same kit without the mudguards, it just seemed cool to have one model of the same kit with slightly different features. Moving upward takes to the taillights and the brush guards. On this kit here, the taillight housing and the brush guards are integrally molded as one piece, and they simply just get dropped into place with no problems to mention. Although they are rather simplistic compared to the other kits on the market, this one here, for this particular build, the stock taillights work just fine. What's neat is that the taillights do have the lens detailing integrally molded in. This would include the cat's eye on the top and the small little rectangular light found on the bottom. And just like on all these videos, I frequently mention on painting them accordingly. For the one here on the left hand side, the oval cat's eye is painted in red, while the little rectangle section is painted in silver. For the light on the opposite side, the silver section is the same, just the top oval section is painted in black. Moving forward takes to the grouser cover areas, and on the model here they are molded hollow, which is a nice touch. And just like I mentioned in the other Monogram Sherman video, I fabricated the mesh area out of a small piece of photo etch mesh. The piece was simply cut the shape and mounted, giving it the appropriate detailing that you see here. Of course, the same thing was done to the unit on the opposite side. From there, it takes us to the Pioneer tools. The tools that you see on this model are kit supplied and are actually decently rendered. One thing that's really unique about this version of the Sherman is that the layout is very different compared to several other vehicles in the Sherman family. Note on this side we have the shovel, the pickaxe head, as well as the pickaxe handle, and they're located on the driver's side. Generally, these components would be located along this area over here, along with the pry bar, as well as the axe. But on an early pattern M4A1 Sherman, it would be in this type of a configuration. The pieces are separately molded and are decently rendered, specifically again for the age of the tooling, and were simply just painted and weathered to the format that you see here and then mounted to the model. One thing that I do want to mention is with the handles. If you notice on this one here, I painted them to replicate a red-brown or just a natural wood coloring, as opposed to the other M4A1 from Monogram that I touched upon earlier. That one I actually painted the wooden handles to replicate them as painted in olive drab. Both of which are appropriate for a World War II Sherman tank. It just depends on personal choice and preference. Continuing upward takes to the rear engine deck, and all the detail you see here are stock, and for what they are, they actually work pretty well. For weathering, of course, I did my usual spilt fuel type technique, and on a Sherman, the fuel tanks would be on either side here of the sponson, and on this one over here, this would be used to top off the fuel for the auxiliary generator. One other thing I want to mention with M4A1s is that because of the way the upper hull is molded, you do not have the separate turret guard armor, which would be found on welded versions of the Sherman. And because of that, you have no drainage holes, which would be found in these locations on those other vehicles. On an M4A1, with the geometry of everything, the water just naturally runs along these areas, basically in the format that I weathered here with the fuel spillage. Moving forward takes to the bow hatches, and this is one bit of detailing that looks a little bit different compared to the other Monogram Sherman that I touched upon earlier. This one, you'll see that the original molded on handles were replaced with new ones made from bent wire, of course to improve the detailing, but you'll notice that the remainder of the hatch is very, very simplistic and is naked of some other types of detailing. This would include the brush guards, which are found on the other edition, as well as even the counterbalance support springs, which would be found on other vehicles, even with the small hatch type. When the Sherman was first developed, the springs were something that wasn't even conceived of, and the brush guards were also something that came later on. With this vehicle here being this early vintage, it would be more appropriate to have these details omitted. Unlike in comparison to the other Sherman that I just mentioned, that one I went ahead and modeled it with having several additional upgrades on it, which is why you'll see it with a few other details that are omitted from this particular example here. Moving forward takes to the remainder of the details, starting with the front air blower. The air blower is the stock original unit, and as you can see is pretty adequately detailed. This is the original one. There was no need to replace it, unlike the other OTR Sherman, where because of the condition of the model, it was deemed best to amputate this section and replace it with one that I had in my spare box. For this particular example here, however, that just wasn't necessary, so the kit original one was simply kept as is. From the air blower, hopefully you get to see the cast texturing that I added to the model surface, which was again done in a way to improve the model from the original kit offering. From the texturing, moves us forward, and here you can see the bow headlights as well as the brush guards. These are the kit original ones, and these details are actually pretty decently rendered with the out-of-the-box offering. Of course, the only addition I made was with the little canister that's found on either side here of the brush guard, and these are used to house a little plunger that's kept in this section, and it's used to plug up the hole for the headlight when the headlight is not present. The canister itself is fabricated out of a thin piece of shrink tubing that was shrunk to shape snipped to the appropriate size, and simply mounted to the two areas that I frequently mention. On the Bow M1919, this is again the kit one, and the kit one is pretty decently rendered. The only thing I did was, with a very small Dremel bit, I drilled out the muzzle section here of the barrel. One bit of detailing that you'll see absent on this model is the Tarpon Ring, which is generally found, and it's an iconic bit of detailing found on Shermans in this area. This bit of detailing was something that was also developed later on past this particular example of a Sherman that we have here. Moving upward to the turret, just like what I mentioned in the other video with all of the mods that were made, this vehicle here received the exact same type of configuration. For the surface, cast texturing was added on all the appropriate locations, giving it for that proper look. The little notch that we have right here was added. Of course, this notch is used to index the turret to remove those slot screws, which keeps the turret ring in place. It is absent on the stock kit, but was a simple addition to make, and once added, again, improves everything. The mantlet was improved with the cast texturing, as well as the small little holes that would be found on the real mantlet for the use of slot screws, which are in various locations. The molded in M1919 barrel sub is actually pretty good in its overall detailing, and again, I just drilled it out in order to improve the look further. The barrel is a two-part assembly, which means there is going to be a seam to contend with on the top and bottom portions, which is quite customary on these tank model kits, be it from the vintage era to even the contemporary era, and it was polished away in the same manner as you see on basically any other build. A little bit of sandpaper, some thick super glue, and a little bit of polishing was really all that was required to get the unit to the condition that we have here. The barrel just clips directly into place with some interior turret mounts. They work very well, and it's a very simple installation, but one thing I do want to mention is that when you secure on the Screamin Mimi rocket bed, it does add a bit of weight to this area, so these units will have a tendency to want to droop on you. In order to fix this, a few drops of white glue were added to the inside just to stiffen it up. With the white glue, you could see that the barrel is nice and stiff, and I could adjust the elevation accordingly. Of course, white glue is the type of thing where it's great, but after a while, if you continue playing with it, it will eventually just loosen up to the point where it'll just have no effect. But it's a very simple thing to fix. All you gotta do is just reapply the white glue in the exact same areas, and the elevation will be taken care of for another good long duration of time. On the rear portion of the turret takes us to the rear lift hooks, and this is something that I did want to mention. With the way the kit is designed, the lift hooks are a bit tricky to install into place. Because there is no tongue or groove system on the hook, it just basically just sits there on the turret molding. The issue is that the piece will want to just fall in during the portion where the glue is setting. So one trick that I did was during the assembly, before the turret halves were assembled, the top and bottom section specifically, I took some strips of sheet styrene and glued them horizontally in this section. Once the glue set, this acts as a bridge, and it allowed me to mount the lift hook here into its appropriate location without any problems. Moving up takes to the bustle area, namely the antenna well. The antenna well is the kit original unit, and I simply just added the drainage hole, which is a bit of detailing found on all Shermans with the 75mm turret. The hole itself was added with a small Dremel bit as well as a pin vise. Directly next to the antenna well is the secondary antenna base mount. This bit of detailing is absent on the stock Monogram tooling, and this is a bit of detailing that is present on all of the Sherman tank turret castings, the very early ones included. To fabricate this detailing, this is a resin casting. It's actually a copy from the secondary antenna mount that's found on the Tamiya early production Sherman turret. The mold was made out of some clay, where I stamp it onto the area on the Tamiya turret, leaving for the pattern embossed into the clay, and then I could just go ahead, add the resin, casting the piece. If anyone wants to know more about this technique, I actually show it in depth in the other Monogram M4A1 old tank repair video that I've already referenced several times thus far. Once the piece was fitted in place, again, with the same Dremel bit, I added the other little drainage hole, which would be found on this section as well. Hopping back to the front portion takes us to the vane sight that we have right here. This bit of detailing is absent on this model and was fabricated out of some lengths of strips of styrene. There is a secondary vane sight found on the hatcher of the cupola, which is something that would be present on very early patterns of the Sherman. Obviously, that's exactly the type of pattern that we have right here. The cupola vane sight was also one fabricated out of the same styrene strip that I touched upon before. Moving to the opposite side of the turret's front brings us to what would normally be the turret periscope. However, on this one here, it has been utilized for a different purpose. Like I mentioned in the other video, the Sherman, when it received the Screamin Mimi setup, would have originally had the firing cables funneled into the rear antenna base mount that would be located in this area. However, if you do this, you lose the capability of having a radio found in the turret. So rather than going with that approach, they went ahead and utilized, or I should say repurposed, the mounting section here for the periscope. The periscope prism was removed, and the wires for the firing cables would just be inserted in place. This bit of detailing was modified from the kit original because the kit just has your standard USAFE periscope molded in. And to be fair, the one on this kit here is fairly decent. But in order to make it in this type of configuration, the unit had to have been amputated altogether. To replace this detailing, I had on hand a set of periscope inserts from Dragon. The Dragon Sherman periscopes were very nicely done because they feature a separate base as well as cover cap in order to have some good detailing on that part. Well, since I had some extra, they proved to be invaluable for the Screamin Mimi builds that you have here, as well as the other one that I mentioned. The original periscope location was removed with the Dremel, with a very small high-speed removal bit, which was the same size as the Dragon periscope base, which basically slipped directly in place where it needed to go. The periscope base is mounted in reverse as it would be on the real units, so that the cover cap for the periscope would hinge to the front, allowing the cables to slide in the rear area. The top portion here of the cover cap was just the Dragon one and was mounted in place after the wiring was stuffed in to the appropriate location. On the real unit, this section here is spring-loaded, so it just basically stays in the open slot. The only thing preventing it from closing, of course, are the wires. From the firing cables takes us to the antenna base, and this is an aspect found on many Screamin Mimi Shermans that is pretty interesting. Because with the way this setup is organized, you're not going to be able to have an antenna base mounted in its traditional location in the rear well area on the back. So many of them fabricated this crude mounting bracket that would just be welded directly to the side of the turret, and this would be the new location for the antenna base. What's really interesting about the Monogram kit is the choice of antenna base that they gave you. They gave you, instead of the standard tried and true MP48, which, by the way, would work for this model, they went ahead and supplied you with the earlier MP37. The MP37 is a very interesting choice, and obviously you'll notice it's one that I utilize on this build rather than swapping it out with an MP48 like I did on the other Sherman. The choice of the MP37 was a very unique one done by Monogram because the MP37 is not generally utilized or seen on models in 1/35 scale, or in this case, 1/35 scale adjacent. And Monogram did actually a really good job with rendering this bit of detailing. When it comes to painting an MP37, it's a bit different compared to the MP48 counterpart. With the MP48, you have a porcelain insulator that is found on the top extremities section of the antenna base itself. However, on the MP37, it's actually on the bottom, and it's this UFO round-shaped dish object that you can see right here on the bottom area. In order to paint the porcelain, it's the same exact color and procedure that I've touched upon a number of times with the MP48 counterpart. The red you see is Tamiya Hull Red, which, by the way, in my opinion, is the best color to replicate that nice amber porcelain that you see on those units. And in order to make it shine further, a small little swipe of gloss lacquer was applied to the porcelain section after the hull red was dried. Once the gloss is added, the piece is complete, and it always looks exquisite on these American tanks. And it's, again, one of those bits of detailing that literally almost everybody forgets to paint on their builds. Like, seriously, guys, just paint the damn insulators. It's not hard. Moving downward takes us to the main cable found on the antenna. Of course, because the antenna was moved to the outside portion of the vehicle, you still have to connect it to the electronics, and this was done with a long extender cable that we have right here. The wire itself is made out of a very thin gauge silicone wire, and I'm going to be touching more upon this when I go to the remainder of the wiring found on the Screamin Mimi. The wire, once added, really does give a nice little bit of detailing on this model. And one nice thing about this wire is that it's very flexible, and it allows you to basically form it to just about any shape you could think of, which is fantastic because once added in place, you get the nice natural sag and flow of the wire as you would on the real one. On the rear portion over here, there would be some kind of a socket, not really a socket, it's more or less, I believe, the bottom portion of an MP48, and that would be used just to plug up the size of hole that's found in the turret, and it will allow the wire to enter into the turret with much better ease. In order to fabricate that detailing, it's just, on this one, made out of a thin piece of resin that I turned on the lathe. I drilled it out and then secured it in place. Once added, it really does do a good job giving you that little bit of extra detailing required for this setup. Before we jump to the Screamin Mimi setup, I do want to briefly touch upon the M2HB that's used on this model. The kit does originally supply you with an M2HB, and what's unique is that it renders out the very early cradle mount, which would be appropriate for a very early production M4, or in this case an M4A1 Sherman. However, the detailing on the M2 itself was very, very simplistic, so rather than utilizing that one, I swapped it out with this unit that we have here. In my stash, I had a 3D printed M2 HB 50 caliber mounted on the M23 cradle. The same procedure I mentioned in the other Screamin Mimi Sherman video, but that one was an AN M250, while this one here is the standard M2 HB. This unit here was procured from the same vendor that I was able to acquire the other unit from, and that link can be found in the video description listed below. That M2 is basically one of the finest examples of an M2HB in 1/35 scale, and the cradle detailing, not to mention the ammo can detailing, is exquisite. The unit was basically just painted, weathered, and mounted to this model. Although the model is 1/32 scale and the M2 is 1/35, it does fit and blend in with the remainder of the detailing without any problems, as it did on the other build. With the 50 out of the way, this is now time to jump to the Screamin Mimi setup, which first takes us to the mantlet area. And we're not talking about the 75, we're talking about the elevation ring here. Like I mentioned in the other Screamin Mimi video, the Calliope system has this one weird design flaw where when they first designed it, they intended this ring here to slip over the 75 and weld to this area right over here. Then the yoke hooks up to it so that when the barrel goes up and down, so does the entire system. I guess it works pretty well with elevation. However, one oversight that this setup has is that if you secure the ring to the 75mm gun, you now forfeit the use of the 75 and you can no longer use it. The problem is if you shoot the 75mm gun, when the gun recoils, the shock and the vibration from this movement will cause damage to occur on the Screamin Mimi setup. Obviously, quite a bit of a problem, specifically when you want to keep your tank with a 75mm gun. Remember, the Calliope system was an upgrade to be mounted in field. This was something you just pick a random Sherman out of the motor pool, mount the system to it, and voila, you now have a vehicle equipped with the rockets. What some enterprising individual figured out when installing these in field was that rather than securing this to the barrel, If they secure this to the armored collars found on the mantlet, they could effectively have the function of the elevation, but not hinder the 75mm gun. It was a very simple thing to take care of, and again, it makes you wonder who works at Ordnance Corps who didn't think about that solution. But with the way the Monogram kit is designed, you have the ring, it's molded onto this little square plate, and the plate fits perfectly right here in its appropriate location between the collar. One thing that needs to be done to the ring, however, is that when you see the original kit part, it's not a ring. It's just this disc that's molded solid. To improve the look of this, I went ahead and hollowed out the hockey puck looking like setup to resemble the appropriate ring. This was done with a Dremel as well as with a needle file, and a lot of care needs to be done during this procedure because with the thicknesses, or thinnesses I should say, of the part in question, this is something you can easily break, and if it breaks, you're not going to be able to fix it, and you're going to be on the hook to scratch build a brand new one. Fortunately, on this one, and even on the last Screamin Mimi setup, that wasn't the case, and I was able to hollow the piece out accordingly. The next thing I want to mention are the arms that hold up the Screamin Mimi setup. The kit does have this pretty decently illustrated as well as executed. To secure these to the turret, there is a small little material on the bottom portion of the turret that you do have to remove. Fortunately, this is well illustrated in the instructions as well as in the moldings. There's a small little thin piece of plastic molded in this area here that is way thinner than the remainder of the turret to a certain shape. So if you go in there with a needle file, you can quickly and easily remove the necessary material for the piece to be fitted in place. Once the material is removed, there's a little bit of hand fitting, but not a whole lot in order to get the piece to mount on accordingly. One other thing I noticed, and this is true for both of these monograms, is that even though the pieces are mounted on correctly, you are going to have to remove a little bit of material on the bottom portion here of the arms because it will make contact with the side rail as well as also the rear intake here on the engine deck. With that little bit of material removed, it clears these two sections absolutely perfectly. Jumping up to the rocket bed, this was probably the hardest part of this build. Not with the assembly, that goes by really easy and effortlessly, and it's also pretty well designed. However, the one difficulty part of this assembly involves the seam removal. You see, every row of tubes that you see here comprises of a two-part assembly. So just like with the barrels, you will have some seams to deal with, but on this one it's amplified because you have seams on the sides, the front, and the back. And to make matters worse, you have to do that to every one of these sections. And as you can see, there's quite a bit to contend with. I touched upon this in the other video where because everything was assembled, taking care of the seams was a chore, and again, it was the hardest part of the build. However, the difference between this build and that build was a rebuild, and because of that, I didn't have the luxury of having the pieces separate. So I had to just muscle through and do the seam work when everything was pre-assembled. With this one here, fortunately, it was a new build, so I was able to deal with the seams without everything pre-assembled, and this did simplify the job immensely. So much so that if you're working on one of these models and you're going to be dealing with the seams, you want to do it before you assemble everything together. I know this sounds like an extra step because you're going through the motions, and these things really do go together really, really fast, and you're having fun, you're building it, and the next thing you know, you're going to have to deal with the seams. So if you are going to deal with the seams, you want to pump your brakes, get the pieces, or I should say get the halves assembled first, let them set and dry, and then go through the motions of dealing with the seam. Fortunately, the seams on the sides aren't bad. It's just, you use super glue and you polish everything down. There is a small little brace or strip, I should say, molded into either side, and this is something you have to be careful with, but it's not something that's really hard to contend with. The hard part is with the front and the rear. Because you have that seam that runs across every section, this is harder than a regular gun barrel because you have each and one of these little segments over here that needs a little drop of glue on them, and then you can start the puttying. But you also have to take a needle file and then make sure that the piece stays round. Again, doable, but difficult. And the funny thing is this type of procedure is seen on several other Screamin Mimi, or I should say T34 Calliope systems that are on the market in 1/35th scale. The Italy one, and I'm pretty sure the Academy one, are exactly the same. Only their back's a little bit different, but that's a topic for another video. The same type of job needs to be done on the rear portions, but on the rear it's actually harder because you have these little pegs that are molded in for the wiring cables. And again, it's doable, but you really need to take your time and you need to use just the right amount of glue in order to plug up these seams. It will take several attempts, but once you've finished, it really does do a good job with blending everything together. On the end sections, don't use putty. I can tell you for a fact because I made that mistake when I built one of these models back in the 90s. I tried to use putty to plug up these little gaps and it was just a disaster. And it actually was way more work for me to unclog them 20 years later. So that's something to avoid. I found the best way to do it is with thick super glue. Add the drop of glue, let it fully set. Once it's dry, you can polish it up and down with some sandpaper and then go over the side sections with a needle file. It's tedious, but doable. However, once done, it leaves some really nice results. The last thing I want to mention about the rockets are with the wiring. This was something that I touched upon in the other Sherman video, but one thing that I always thought was really cool on the Screamin Mimis was with the way the wires are configured. The rockets, of course, are electrically fired, and because of that, you will have leads connected to every single one of these rocket tubes. This looks like a daunting task when you're trying to figure out, but fortunately there's a really helpful image out there on the internet, and I have it posted on the screen here in the corner. Not to mention I have that link found in the video description. That photograph is, I believe, taken from the tech manual, and it shows the exact diagram of how these things are wired. And it was a godsend on the last Screamin Mimi, and it was also extremely helpful for this one. The wiring is the same silicone-coated wire that I touched upon before on the antenna for the same reasons, but you notice on this one here, I went ahead and mounted them in a slightly different way compared to what I did on the other Sherman. Regardless, both ways are perfectly fine and accurate. It's just, pick your poison type thing. The wiring was a bit tedious, but again, was one that once you're done, it extremely helps the look of the build, and it just makes it look 10 times better compared to leaving it absent. If you're someone that is a beginner or you don't have that type of patience or nerve to do something like this, just leave the thing wireless and call it a day. But once the wires are added, you really have to admit that it really does enhance the look of this model tenfold, and it really transforms it from a vintage model kit to something that looks much more contemporary. Moving along takes us to the paint, markings, and the weathering. For the model's paintwork, I went with a camouflage scheme. This paint job here would be something that was pre-Operation Cobra, where we have the red-brown airbrushed over the base olive drab. Something like this you would see in the ETO theater, so we're looking at France, 1944 or so, but you would also see this type of paint job in Italy around the same time as well. For the model's paintwork, the base coat was my own shade of early war olive drab, and I've touched upon this color on several other builds found on this channel. The camouflage is red-brown, and specifically it's Tamiya acrylic red-brown that was airbrushed over the appropriate locations. Outside of the camouflage pattern, this vehicle does have something else that I haven't incorporated on any other builds that are found on this channel, nor is it really something that I've seen done very frequently on other models on the internet. And that has to do with counter shading. Now, counter shading is a camouflage technique that was done quite a bit during World War II, but specifically, it's generally more or less thought of as a British thing. Like, for instance, the Firefly is the most famous example of counter shading done on a Sherman tank variant. However, the Americans did counter shading as well. If we look at the barrel over here on this model, you'll see that there's counter shading done on the lower portion, and it's done basically in the same format as the Brits did with the little wave. On this model here, this is done with flat white, and it's applied via a paintbrush, so you get that nice crisp edge that you see along the wavy sections. Of course, this is seen on both sides of this model. Aside from the barrel, there was counter shading done to one other location on this vehicle, and it's one that's not generally thought of, specifically in terms of Sherman tank camo schemes. And that is on the lower hull, in between these areas here of the bogie housings. It's obviously found on both sides, and it's painted with the exact same white that I utilized for the counter shading on the barrel sections. There is photographic proof of this exact same paint scheme that is available. In fact, I'll even throw one or two of the photographs up on screen. Granted, these vehicles are not an M4A1 Sherman for the few nutty, crazy people out there that love to start arguments about literally nothing, but the camouflage pattern is still legit nonetheless. Unlike the under the barrel section where I used a paintbrush, for these ones here, you'll notice that I used an airbrush for the application. This is why you're able to see these white cloud sections found in the center sections, and then where the bogie housings are, you can start seeing the olive drab bleed in. The counter shading really gives a nice, unique look to this vehicle, and it really does differentiate it compared to all the other vehicles that I've built and even showcased on this channel in the past. For the color, there is another rendition known out there where rather than white being used, a light blue was utilized in place. And I've also seen some where there's a little bit of counter shading down here on the transmission cover, but I'll save that for another build for another day. Now that's just with the paint scheme for the tank in question, but with this tank being upgraded with the T34 Calliope system, I went ahead and added another layer to the paintwork. Like I touched upon before, and also in the other video, the Calliope system was just picked from a random Sherman found in the motor pool. So the Calliope was a completely different color on occasion compared to the remainder of the vehicle. So here we have the vehicle here with the early shade of OD with the camouflage pattern, but this one was chosen to be equipped with the Screamin Mimi. Well, okay, they went ahead, mounted the unit in place, and the unit is in a different, darker shade of olive drab compared to the remainder of the vehicle. The Calliope system was something that was developed a little bit later on, so because of that, the darker olive drab would be something that would generally be seen. Having said that, there were examples of vehicles where they were all the same coat of OD green, but for my model here, I like having the things in different color just so it adds a little bit more uniqueness to the model, and it's also a way to add a little bit more color, giving it for a more eye-popping type feature. For the model's markings, I utilized the kit supplied water slide decals. The quality of the kit supplied decals is actually really good. They went on without any problems, and I was able to seal everything with the VMS matte varnish without any problems to mention. For weathering, I utilized my typical techniques, which would include filters, washes, counter shading, as well as dry brushing. And since in this video I've mentioned the other Monogram Sherman build enough times, I might as well go ahead and give that build a nice little quick cameo. Of course, if anyone is interested, I have an entire video dedicated to the rebuild of this one over here, and that can be found in the video description listed below. But with the two together, you really get to see the subtle differences that I made to the two, differentiating them from one another. Some subtle differences would be like the brush guards that I mentioned before, how this one has them and this one don't, along with the Tarpon Ring found for the 1919. This unit here has an MP48 spring antenna, while this one here has the MP37. It's going to be hard to see, but this one here has the AN M250, while this one here has a standard M2HB. This one here has got the dimpy little mudguards, while this one here is left mudguardless. However, the biggest change between the two examples is with the rear hull area. This one here has the original M3 Lee type rear hull design with the pepper pot exhaust, while this example here has the upgraded and revised rear hull area where the pepper pots were no longer present, but their locations were welded over. The standard gooseneck exhaust was mounted on the top, air filtration boxes were added to the sides, and hull extenders were required in order to protect the air filtration boxes as well as secure them to the vehicle. It's small little subtleties like this is why I love Sherman tanks. In the end, I'm really happy in how this one turned out. I was always a huge fan of the Monogram 1/32 scale M4A1, and having a second go-ahead at one of these builds here is something that was a very enjoyable experience for me. These Monogram kits here are always a blast to work on, and this one here is no exception, which is actually pretty astounding considering the age of the tooling that's found on this model. And I suppose that's a perfect point to springboard us into skill level and recommendation. This model here, although it is a very easy and forgiving build, I can't necessarily recommend it as a first model to start with as a beginner. The reason why I say that is with the added complexity of the Calliope system. The Calliope does go together pretty easily, however, you do have to make some modifications to the turret in order to properly mount the components to their correct locations. This is something that may give a beginner a little bit of difficulty in trying to figure this out. If you're going to build this model sans the rocket system, then that kind of changes things, and then this does become a very beginner-friendly model indeed. Aside from the beginner, anyone who has an intermediate to an advanced range skill set can definitely tackle one of these builds without any problems whatsoever. However, I'm pretty sure several of the more advanced builders out there will probably see this kit as being a bit archaic and may find several of the molding and details to be not up to their standards. But this now leads us into the next segment, which is recommendations. And this is where this kit actually does become very interesting, specifically for one of those types of individuals. Although the stock details are on the simplistic end, because this vehicle is an M4A1 Sherman, this does open up huge possibilities in terms of aftermarket details. Even though the model is 1/32 scale, because 132 and 135 are so close to one another, you can easily outrig this thing with as many 1/35 scale components as one might deem fit to enhance it further past the condition that we have here. As we can recall, several components on this model here were upgraded from 1/35 scale spare parts, as well as even the M2HB is a 1/35 scale M2, but when mounted to this 1/32 scale Sherman tank here, it basically all just fits in and fills out as it would on the 1/35 scale counterpart. And if there's one vehicle type out there in the 1/35 scale realm that has a plethora of aftermarket details, it would indeed be the Sherman tank. There are tons of modifications for this pattern vehicle in resin, plastic, 3D print, photo etch, you name it, there are a ton of options out there in order to take this model to the next level. So if you're one of those people that like to roll up your sleeves and really enhance a model past its original kit offering, one of these Monogram M4A1s here is definitely something not to discount. Outside of that person, I would also recommend this kit for anyone who's looking to get back into the hobby of plastic models. Because this kit is as old as it is, this is very similar to what I mentioned in the Panther Alpha A video from Tamiya, where many people out there, they built this kit back in the day when they were first released, but they moved on from the hobby, set it aside to do other things, but are looking to get back into the hobby now at a later date. Well, one of these kits here is a fantastic way to re-enter into the hobby, and it's basically a nice little welcome mat. Because of these kits' relative simplicity and also at the time of filming this, their relative affordableness, they are a great way to dust off and polish off many of your skill sets that you haven't exercised in quite a while. Plastic modeling is very similar to working out, and you can develop a bit of atrophy if you haven't worked in the hobby for a very long period of time. Well, because again of the simplicity of these kits here, this is a great way to dust off many of those skills before you could tackle something a little bit more complex, say from Tamiya, Dragon, or even a Ryefield model tank. If you start from the gate with one of those models, you're going to be in a little over your head, and this may lead to results that are less than desirable. This is not just true for the build itself, but also for the painting. Along similar lines to that type of person, I would also recommend this kit for anyone who is a fan of vintage plastic tank model kits. Needless to say, this is a vintage tank kit, and if you're the type of person that digs working on old school model kits like, well, yours truly, or you just like to build and collect models, This kit here is a really nice addition to add to your collection. Again, specifically as at the time of filming this, they are relatively available and also can be had for relatively affordable prices. Of course, I would easily recommend this model for anyone who's a die-hard fan of the Sherman. If you're a Shermanaholic like yours truly, you want to have basically every single pattern of Sherman represented, from the M4 to the M4A1, M4A3, and so on. This pattern is a very unique rendition of the Sherman tank, and I'm not even referring to it with the Screamin Mimi setup. That's a whole nother aspect to this build. I'm talking about just the baseline early production DV M4A1 Sherman that the kit is built upon. Like I touched upon before, there aren't really that many examples of this particular pattern of Sherman represented in 1/35 scale. Even though this model is slightly larger in 1/32, it can easily fit into a 1/35 scale Sherman collection without any problems. Now you take that and you add on the T34 Calliope system to it, this really makes this model a very special and unique piece that will easily enhance your collection. And I think it goes without saying that if you're a fan of the Sherman, chances are really good you're going to be interested in not just World War II armor, but American armor in general. And again, this kit here would fit into your collection really, really well if that's the case. Finally, the last person who I'd recommend this kit to would be anybody who's a parent or a grandparent and are looking for some sort of activity to share with their child or their grandchild. Because of the simplicity of these models, they go together very quickly and relatively easily. Because of these attributes, they would make an excellent choice for a weekend type project or something to do on an afternoon. One other benefit that these models do have is that because of the era that they were designed in, they do have some playability built into them, which is another added plus, specifically if you're looking for that type of a application. However, a build like this will probably be one that's very enjoyable. They'll have a lot of fun building it, and perhaps will lead them onto the path of picking up the armor hobby or just plastic model building as a nice little enjoyable hobby. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/32 scale M4A1 Sherman tank with the T34 Calliope system. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small scale model showcase videos like this one over here, or the other large scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.